While many of the talks today will consider animals as they lived or were represented in antiquity, my presentation will focus instead upon the moment of their death. Scholars, especially Jean-Pierre Vernant, Marcel Detienne, and in more recent years Pauline Schmidt-Pantel, have rightly pointed out that the sharing of cooked meat was one of the most fundamental of communal acts in antiquity, key to the formation of identity, and that the only proper manner of preparing meat for consumption was a ritual act of blood sacrifice. While we might dispute the degree to which every act of animal consumption necessitated a corresponding performance, the intersection of dietary habits and ritual can be traced as far back as the tale of Hesiod's Prometheus in the Greek mythic tradition, and further still in the archaeological record of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Although this point of intersection has been effectively discussed on a theoretical level, how can we apply the resultant paradigm, that animals sacrificed are also eaten and can thus be found in the osteological record, and utilized to further understand a community's identity to a specific archaeological question? All right, and just to let you guys know, I guess before this malfunction, there was a nice, lovely timeline right here showing you Selinus' history. But just to give you context, Selinus is here, and this is a ground plan of its classical form. In order to formulate such a question, it is important to highlight Vernon's own stress upon sacrifice, and therefore diet's crucial role in reflecting collective identity. Furthermore, it is important to qualify Vernon's conception by defining collective here as on a factional and even familial level, rather than with the scope of an entire settlement or region. Groups are defined by the participation of individuals, so a bottom-up conception of identity, which allows for hybrid communities, rather than top-down, is far more appropriate in discussions of ancient identity construction. With this in mind, an as of yet unresolved question concerns ethnic and cultural identity at the site of ancient Selinus in the 4th century and later Hellenistic period. It is important to note that you will hear two terms in our discussion, Selinunte, when referring to the site as a spatial unit, and Selinus, when referring to the ancient city specifically. Selinus, a Greek colonial foundation of Megara and Megara in the 7th century BCE in western Sicily, for many is most famous for its war with the nearby native settlement of Segesta, which instigated the ill-fated Athenian expedition during the Peloponnesian War. This rivalry between the two cities would later pull in another major power, Carthage. Selinus would eventually be sacked by Carthage in 409 BCE. The site would be resettled following the conquest and continuously occupied by a relatively smaller population until the city's ultimate abandonment in 250 BCE during the First Punic War, when its citizens were moved to Lilybaeum in the west. During this period between 409 and 250, Selinus, placed at the border between the Punic and Syracusan spheres of influence, changed hands continuously. These shifts in the city's allegiance were facilitated by the actions of Greek generals and tyrants such as Hermocrates, Agathocles, and Pyrrhus of Epirus, and their Punic contemporaries, especially those of the Barcid family. All right, and so this is a picture of, this is a picture of Hellenistic Selinunte, and then a picture of Opus Africanum and Pavimenta Punica, which I'll discuss shortly. While the Greekness of the city prior to 409 is evident, especially in its famed peripheral temples, the express identity of the settlement's inhabitants following the conquest is far less certain. For decades, it was assumed that the majority of the population remained Greek, until in the 1950s and 60s, when first Antonino de Vita, then Vincenzo Tusa made a strong case for a Punic presence, pointing to the similarities between the material culture found in Punic settlements in North Africa and the archaeological record from post-conquest Selinunte. One need only mention the shifts towards the construction technique aptly named Opus Africanum, so here, instead of the previously preferred ashlar masonry, and the use of Pavimenta Punica with its characteristic ceramic chips embedded in a cocho pesto, incorporating in some cases signs of religious symbols such as Tanit. Following this line of interpretation proposed by De Vita and Tusa, more recently Dieter Mertens and Sophie Hellas have come to a far more radical proposition, suggesting that in the 4th century BC, Selinus was resettled by an entirely Punic population, with the city becoming a sort of colony of Carthage. In turn, Merton and Hellas' proposal has been disputed by Rosanna di Simone and Clemente Marconi, who have both called for a reconsideration of the material from the site and for a more balanced approach to the issue of identity, by proposing the presence at Selinus post-409 of a mixed Greek and Punic population, a suggestion followed recently by Franco de Angelis. So this is a picture of Temple B, which I'll be discussing shortly. Particularly significant in this regard is the new project by the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University, focused on the main urban sanctuary on the Acropolis. In the first phase of this project, the attention was focused on Temple B, which can now be restored as a Doric pro-style tetrastyle temple, remarkable for its thoroughly Greek appearance and adherence to the Doric canon. The temple most probably was dedicated to Demeter, as will be discussed later. Temple B can now be dated to about 300 BCE, and we finally have some evidence for its material culture associated with it. It is partly based on this new assessment of Temple B and its material culture that the argument that Greeks comprised a not insignificant part of Punic Selinus has been made. Sophie Hallas, in advocating for a homogeneous Punic population, allowed for three possibilities to explain this temple. Either the temple was built in a brief period of Greek reoccupation under Agathocles or Pyrrhus, that the Punic population simply decided to build a Greek-style temple in opposition to their normal practice, or finally, that there would still have been Greeks at the site. This last point is only briefly raised as, if one allows for a Greek presence at this temple, then one might begin to question other characteristics of the post-409 site used as evidence for a homogeneous Punic material culture. Thus far, the debate about the ethnic and cultural identity of the population of Selinus in the Hellenistic period has focused upon less robust markers of identity, such as architectural design, building techniques. Well, now the background seems to be working. That's pleasant. Such as architectural design, building techniques, or ceramic analysis. In my paper, I would like to contribute to discussion by applying the paradigm raised at the beginning of the paper, that identity can be traced through the animals that were communally consumed through sacrifice, to the faunal record found at Temple B and at the so-called sanctuary of Melophoros. As we will see, the dietary practices of Greeks and Punic Phoenicians have key differences, and so the animal sacrifice will help us to determine the composition of the population of Selinunte post-409. In identifying cultural difference through sacrifice between the Phoenicians and Greeks at Selinunte and the wider Mediterranean, one variable stands out: the consumption of pork. On the part of the Greeks, the consumption of pork was certainly popular prior to the Roman period, in opposition to previous scholarly claims. We have evidence for consumption of pigs during so-called Olympian sacrifices, as well as holocaustic sacrifices for heroic or chthonic figures, and other forms of non-consumptive sacrifice, with the hurling of pigs into pits during Demeter's Thesmophoria being perhaps the most famous. This utilization of pigs in cults, however, is hardly a universal truth in the ancient Mediterranean. Melinda Zader and others have identified pork avoidance in many areas of the so-called Fertile Crescent, and the case has been made for prescriptions against pork, at least in the ritual context, during certain periods of Pharaonic Egypt and Hittite Anatolia. Within this larger framework of prescriptions concerning the sacrifice of pigs, the acknowledgement of possible prohibition against pork for Carthaginians and other Semitic people of the Western Mediterranean requires a careful consideration. It must be remembered that the Jewish prohibition against pork was not culturally specific, but rather a wider phenomena of the area of the Levantine coast in which the original Phoenician cities of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and others were located, from which the original colonists of Carthage and other Punic sites in the west emigrated. Writers such as Porphyry of Tyre speak of an abstention from pork well into the Common Era in Phoenicia. Epigraphic evidence, especially from temple inscriptions found in Lebanon and Syria, describes the banning of pig sacrifice for anything but darker rites in times of crisis, in which the very aversion to pork gives the animal a more potent symbolic function. Turning to the west, scholars have pointed to Livy, who omitted pigs from the description of livestock during his account of the invasion of Carthage during the Second Punic War. Far better literary evidence comes from the description of the sanctuary of Eshmun in Carthage itself, which a worshipper could not enter for 3 days if they had murdered, given birth, eaten beans, or eaten pork. And now we're back to the background not working. So there's an inscription here, which I guess I'll speak to you guys about. So this apparent prohibition against pork was noted by scholarship already in the late 19th century. And my discussion today is not the first to trace the presence of Greek and Punic identities utilizing their variances in consumption, and thus sacrificial practices. Scholars have used this idea to identify the dual cult of Heracles Melkart, described by Herodotus on the Aegean island of Thasos, pictured here. Looking to the inscription IG 12 Supplementum 414, which was in this original location, which concerns itself with a prohibition against the sacrifice of piglets for this Heracles cult. Hervé de Chaune and others have argued that, as the cult was a non-Holocaustic Olympian cult, the inscription would be a sign of a Phoenician presence at Thasos, and thus a corroboration of Herodotus' account. And yet, the discussions about this dual cult at Thasos is limited by the evidence used, literary and epigraphic. While there is evidence for a prohibition of pork in the literary record, Greco-Roman authors, as outside observers, must in this case be taken with a grain of salt. Modern scholarship on Punic Phoenician culture has concerned itself with the deconstruction of the often biased, if not outright antagonistic lens used by these writers. It is necessary to view instead the archaeological record for what it says on the matter of pork consumption. This is unfortunately a difficult task, as faunal analysis from Phoenician sites is generally scarce, with many excavations not understanding the potential benefits of keeping, let alone analyzing, the bones uncovered. That said, there are a few studies that give us a fair picture. All right, and well, thankfully these showed up. But looking at the heart of the Punic sphere, there is strong evidence for an aversion of pork in Carthage itself. Jocko Weinstock, discussing some aspects of the faunal remains from the 1991 Hamburg excavations, discovered that, indeed, pigs made up a relatively small amount of the osteological record. Of the total fragments identified, over 41% are bovine and 38% are sheep and goat. While a comparatively smaller figure, we do find that roughly 10% are able to be identified as pig bones. What is noticeable here is that the relative abundance seems to increase gradually chronologically, and in pre-Roman times, most of the pig remains were found in a single isolated layer. Weinstock also rightly pointed out that the relative lack of pig remains in the earliest level of Carthage, at 2.9%, is almost identical to that from Phoenician sites in Lebanon, such as Kamid el-Loz, and sites in Judea. In 2009, Roald Doctor presented an updated meta-analysis incorporating excavations that took place between 2000 and 2005, with strikingly similar results. Closer to Selinus, M.L. Ryder has reported on the faunal remains from an excavation conducted from 1968 to 1971 at Mozia, a Phoenician settlement on an island located within a lagoon on the western point of Sicily. He also reported on those from a nearby Punic wreck excavated in 72 and 73. Most of the osteological evidence cited by Ryder comes from trenches in the region of the Kothon, Mozia's artificial harbor, in the periphery of the settlement. A great deal of cattle, sheep, and goat bones were discovered, with cattle bones making up between 11 and 57% of total finds, although determined to provide between 80 and 91% of the meat contribution of the total faunal evidence. While pig bones were discovered, they were of a comparatively small amount, 5 and 6% of total bone finds, yet only 3% of overall meat contribution. Within the Punic wreck, found off the northern shore of Isola Longa and dated to the 3rd century, one finds osteological evidence for livestock such as sheep, goat, and ox, as well as fauna such as deer, turtles, and even false killer whales, but no evidence of pigs. What does this osteological data allow us to conclude, independent of the literary evidence? It seems to indicate an aversion to pork in the areas we traditionally identify as Punic. However, there is still some evidence of pork consumption, even if relatively minor or even negligible in pre-Roman periods. Even a presence of 5% appears to argue against a total prohibition of pork in these contexts. Weinstock has delineated two possible theories that might explain this minor presence of pig bones. First, as we know from historical sources, Greeks and other ethnic groups lived in Punic centers such as Carthage, and as a proportion of these populations grew, so too would the consumption of pig. An alternate explanation would be the following. Pork-loving people of non-Punic origin lived spatially segregated from the Punic populations. The former ate larger amounts of pork than the latter, resulting in differences in the spatial distribution of pig remains. We thus have two possible ways of explaining this minor presence of pork consumption, one temporal and the other spatial. However, both of these theories rely upon a certain circular logic. Weinstock took as fact that the Phoenicians, as a Semitic people, would not consume pork in any instance, and from this interpreted the osteological information. There is certainly contradictory evidence. In rural Punic Iberia, pigs were consumed in large numbers, and we do find pigs as livestock in later northeast Sardinia, although in the 2nd and 1st centuries. I would propose a more conservative theory based upon this archaeological data. Rather than a prohibition on pork, it would seem more likely that there existed a general cultural aversion. In order to prove this, we would have to look to the greatest expression of a culture and its consumption patterns, sacrifice. In this case, the previously mentioned sacred law from Thasos is not an exemption. If one moves from the general sphere of consumption patterns to specifically sacred settings in the archaeological context, pigs almost disappear. As mentioned earlier, to enter the temple of Eshmun, one had to abstain from pork for 3 days. Important here is abstention, a point that acknowledges the consumption of pork but recognizes its inherent pollution. Furthermore, on stelae found in Carthage depicting sacrifice, one finds sheep and cows depicted, but not until well in the Roman period do pigs appear at all. The only case in which we do find pigs, and indeed in this case only rarely, is in the Punic Tophet, when buried instead of or along with the bones of a human infant as an alternative for the more traditional lamb. What is notable here is that in this rare example, the pigs would not have been consumed, but rather, as Billie Jean Collins has argued, would have served as symbolic replacements for a human during the act of sacrifice. Looking to the relief from Pozo Moro, a similar situation arises. The demon Moloch appears to be eating a pig, but in this case acting as an appeasing replacement, the pig being an appropriate morsel for a monster of Punic religion instead of a human being. In this case, what is suitable food for a monster is inappropriate for men. In the face of schools that argue either completely for or against the prohibition of pigs, let us instead think of a religious aversion to pork, visible in ritual material culture of Punic cultic sites. Coming to this conclusion, we may turn from a general analysis to the specific context found at Selinunte, that of our apparently Greek Temple B. In addition to architectural analysis, the IFA excavations conducted a series of stratigraphic excavations in the area found at the building and its altar. During the excavation, all earth removed is carefully sifted, and all artifacts and organic remains, without exception, are kept and thoroughly examined. This analysis includes the faunal remains, which is carried out by Roberto Michique, an archaeozoologist of the University of Palermo and one of our main excavators. I would like to thank Roberto for sharing his data with me, as well as the director of the dig, Clemente Marcone, as regards the possibility of discussing these finds and the general interpretation of our stratigraphies. For the topic at hand, I would turn to a large deposit of bones found immediately in front of the altar of Temple B during the excavation of Trench H in 2007. These bones are best associated with ritual activity at the altar, and due to the sealed nature of the context, outside contamination is highly unlikely. As identified by Michique, the majority of the bones found in this deposit were of pigs and wild boars, making up 56% of identifiable osteological finds, with sheep and goats making up only the second most common group. The variance between the number of identified specimens and minimum number of individuals shown to the right is within standard parameters, and thus we can be relatively certain that the sample is uninfluenced by outlying variables. Critically, there are 13 clear signs of butcher marks found on the bones, localized on fatty areas of the body such as the lower vertebrae and limbs, rather than around the neck and head. It is clear from this evidence that one is dealing with an Olympian cult involving the consumption of the victims. To substantiate this, a class of bones was also found bearing signs of cooking, totaling nearly 41% of all classes of mammal finds, an especially high number consistent with the context of recovery in the immediate vicinity of an altar. Over 65% of this group was subjected to temperatures of over 600 degrees centigrade, and Michique also has pointed out that these bones appear to have been burnt after being freshly butchered and still wet. Both aspects of this archaeological record are consistent with consumptive sacrifice, in this case largely of sacrificed pigs. Thus, the original claim concerning the Greek nature of the cult that had until now been based upon more traditional means of locating identity, such as architectural design or pottery analysis, keeping in mind our proposed aversion to pork in Punic ritual practice, is corroborated in the osteological record. As to the identification of the cult, here we may integrate the osteological record into the larger context of material remains found by our IFA mission. A fragment likely belonging to a terracotta bust of a goddess, was discovered in the trenches around the altar of Temple B, similar in style to comparanda from sanctuaries of Demeter and Kore in Sicily and beyond. To this, we may now add the osteological record, as a preference for pig sacrifice in the nomoi of Demeter sanctuaries throughout the Greek world is well attested to. Indeed, Temple B, as a cult place of Demeter constructed around 300, would have been a successor to the older Temple R to the immediate west, excavated by the IFA in more recent years and subject to current study. Excavations at this older temple, recently reported upon, have revealed the sacrifice of piglets, another terracotta bust of a goddess, shown here, and other votive material consistent with the identification of a cult of Demeter. If Temple B's cult of Demeter catered to a Greek community, as indicated by the preference for pigs, where might we locate a cult of Demeter specific for Punic patrons? Demeter was, after all, understood as a major component of the Punic pantheon as well, ever since, as Diodorus relates to us, the Carthaginians suffered a major defeat against Syracuse following their destruction of a sanctuary of Demeter and Kore. Votive offerings and cult sites throughout the Western Mediterranean attest to the popularity of the cults in the wider Punic Phoenician world outside of Carthage, although with many seemingly non-Greco-Roman qualities. Notably, it is not until the Roman conquest of Carthage that one really begins to find Demeter and Kore associated with pigs and boars, with the practice becoming more frequent as one moves into the Common Era. At Selinunte, a solution arises if one moves from the Acropolis to the extra-urban sanctuary of Demeter Melophoros, found on the Gajra hill to the west of the city. One of the oldest sites at Selinus, securely dated to the last decade of the 7th century in its initial phase, the sanctuary experienced a period of renewal and renovation following the conquest of the city in 409, when many of the major non-peripteral, or rather the major peripteral temples began to be abandoned or converted for profane use. As investigated by Donald White, the non-peripteral temple of Melophoros was given a rounded vault at the rear of the naos, and the exterior of the temple facing the hill behind was buttressed by a series of projecting blocks, all renovations that appear to be methods to allow the building to stand against the weight of the eroding hill behind. Tusa and other scholars have assumed that the renovation was for a Greek cult, but there is a great deal of evidence to suggest otherwise. This is supported by some votive dedications, evidenced in an Egyptian Ogi altar with 3 betels, or sacred stones, clearly Carthaginian origin, that Gabrici discovered during his excavations. Furthermore, next to the temenos of the Melophoros sanctuary, we find to the north a second sanctuary, a newly built Naiskos, oftentimes misidentified in this phase as that of Zeus Malikios. Alexander Lazine has rightly pointed out that the shrine's tall podium and diastyle prostyle design has no similarities in Greek sacred architecture, but rather comparanda from Punic Phoenician sites in North Africa and Syria. One finds this Naiskos associated with 3 altars in front, compared by Federica Spagnoli with typologies seen throughout Punic Sicily. The famed Campo di Stelle, uphill from the Naiskos, would in this case be quite compelling if the traditional understanding of this area as a Tophet were true. The identification has been challenged by recent work by Fama and Tusa, however, that showed the Campo in continuous use from the 7th century well into the post-409 period, which instead points to a continuity in the sacred practices here. Certainly not an issue if we consider that the Melophoros temple itself, while being renovated, would have likely still been used as the cult site of Demeter, if not necessarily in the exact form used by the inhabitants of the city in the 5th century. Traditional architectural analysis thus allows us to only go so far. The site began to take on certain more Punic elements, as per the Malikios Naiskos, but there is no longer the critical evidence of a Tophet to make the case of a religious community that identified with a wider Punic practice. Considering the parameters of Punic identity in relation to sacrifice already used to analyze Temple B, a possible solution arises. During the excavation of the sanctuary by Gabrici in the early 20th century, a high proportion of burned goat and sheep bones were found, and even the occasional deer, with little evidence of the sacrifice of pigs. In the later strata of what was once thought to be the Tophet, the burnt bones found are almost exclusively sheep. This is consistent with what we find at Punic sanctuaries of Demeter, where sheep appear to be the preferred sacrificial victim. We know from an account written by Xenophon that Zeus Malikios' cult required holocystic pig sacrifices, and the lack of such evidence goes some way in demonstrating the Punic dominance of the sanctuary at large at this point, and therefore this would not be the shrine of Zeus Malikios. There are 2 caveats which need to be addressed in this case. First, Gabrici published only 1 paragraph on the faunal remains in an otherwise exhaustive tome. While the species represented are clearly outlined, there is no talk of percentages or, most important for our discussion, whether the bones were butchered. From his discussion, one cannot be certain that the sacrifices were not holocaustic or some other form of non-consumptive ritual. That said, it is a symptom of the period rather than a weakness of Grubici's method in particular. The second critique arises out of the epiclesis of Demeter here, Malophoros. Scholars are divided over the interpretation of the epithet, either as sheep-bearer or apple-bearer. Even if we accept that the earlier cult was of the sheep-bearer, this does not inhibit the possibility that the sanctuary would have been seen by Punic inhabitants as a more appropriate focus of their worship of Demeter, rather than that focused upon the Acropolis, which regularly incorporated pig sacrifice and consumption into its ritual practice. Ultimately, the limitations of faunal research conducted in earlier digs, such as that of Malophoros, prevent us from making as clear a claim as to the sacred laws and corresponding markers of cultural identity in that sanctuary as we can concerning the cult at Temple B upon the Acropolis, thanks to the IFA's excavations. Even acknowledging this constraint, using sacrifice and consumption patterns as an interpretive model allows us to make a firmer claim as to the identity of the inhabitants of Selinunte following 409. To conclude, the large quantity of butchered bones found in association with the altar of Temple B, considering the ritual aversion to pork in Punic culture, accentuates the identity markers already found in the temple's architecture, making a strong claim that there was indeed a distinctly Greek presence on the Acropolis of the city. While this refutes previous claims of a homogeneous Punic population post-409, the same model helps us to corroborate aspects of the original thesis that there still were many inhabitants who subscribed to a Punic cultural identity, and suggests a far more complex multi-ethnic ritual topography at the site than previously assumed. Although we need to be aware of and avoid the circularity of using text to interpret materials remains to in turn corroborate text, the intersection of diet, sacrifice, and the osteological remains of animals provides us with another tool in our quest to reinterpret cultic and cultural identity in a multi-ethnic Western Mediterranean. Thank you.